the silence of the prairie and the weight of loneliness. The prairie stretched endlessly, a sea of golden grass swaying under the stubborn Texas sun. Yet for Jacob Miller it was not beauty he saw, but silence that cut through him like a blade. His ranch was vast, his cattle healthy, his barns full, yet his heart remained as empty as the horizon. Every night he returned to a cabin built with his own hands, walls that echoed only with the sound of creaking wood and the wind pressing against the shutters. Neighbors spoke of him as the loner rancher, a man of few words and no family, whose life was reduced to work and the ache of solitude. He had once believed he could endure it, that the land and labor would be enough to fill the hollow, but as the years wore on, he found himself listening to the ticking of his pocket watch and wondering how many more seasons he could survive without hearing another voice calling his name. And so, out of desperation rather than hope, he had written a letter to a mail-order bride agency that promised companionship to men like him who had nothing but land to their name and long nights ahead of them. For months he had waited, every creak of wagon wheels on the dirt road pulling his gaze to the horizon, every unopened envelope raising a tremor in his chest. The day finally came, the day when the wagon rumbled to a stop in front of his ranch, dust rising like a curtain before a stage. Jacob's hand shook as he gripped his hat, his heart pounding not with joy but with fear. Fear of rejection, fear that the woman stepping down would see not a husband, but broken man living in shadows. Yet nothing could have prepared him for what he saw that day when the figure emerged from the wagon, towering, broad-shouldered, a woman twice his size, with eyes that held a story as heavy as his own. The woman who changed the air. When her boots touched the dirt, the very air seemed to shift. Jacob, who had expected a fragile figure in a plain dress, saw instead a woman who seemed carved from the same stubborn soil he worked every day. Her shoulders were broad, her stance unyielding, her frame far larger than his own, and for a fleeting moment Jacob's throat went dry with a mix of shock and shame. The ranch hands who had gathered nearby exchanged glances, some hiding smirks, others raising brows, but Jacob could not move his eyes from hers. They were not mocking or embarrassed. They were strong, deep, carried with them a life that had known hardship, survival, and a quiet pride that demanded respect. She held herself not as someone apologizing for her size, but as a woman who had walked through storms and would walk through more. Jacob's heart twisted, not in disappointment, but in confusion. This was not the wife he had imagined, the delicate comfort he thought he had ordered through ink and paper. And yet, there was something in the way she looked at him, steady and unafraid, that made his chest tighten in a way no dream of a dainty bride ever had. He tipped his hat, his voice low, nearly trembling as he greeted her. The way of the prairie seemed to hush around them, and in that stillness, Jacob realized that this moment, the awkward, unexpected, impossible moment, was the beginning of a story he could not yet name. The awkward first supper. The first hours together were marked not by ease, but by silence that pressed down heavier than the Texas heat. Jacob, unsure how to place his words, led her into the cabin that had been built for two yet never known another soul. He pulled out a chair at the small wooden table, its legs uneven from years of wear, and watched her carefully fold herself into space, her presence seeming to fill every corner of the room. He set down supper, beans, bread, and the cured meat he had prepared days before, feeling almost ashamed of its plainness. His hands fumbled as he poured water into her glass, the callous fingers of a rancher suddenly clumsy under her gaze. She did not laugh, nor did she show impatience. Instead, she picked up her fork with grace that contradicted her size, thanking him softly with a voice that carried warmth he had not expected. It struck Jacob then. She was not here to judge him, nor to play the role of the woman he had imagined. She was flesh and blood, with hunger, with dignity, with a past that surely weighed as heavy as his own. As the meal went on, his fear gave way to curiosity, and he found himself studying the lines of her face, the strength in her hands, the softness in her words. By the time she looked up and met his eyes, a strange feeling stirred inside him. Not quite comfort, not yet love, but something alive, something he had not felt in years. And in that flicker, Jacob realized that perhaps the life he had ordered through paper would not arrive neatly packaged, but would instead demand that he unlearn everything he thought he wanted, secrets beneath the quiet. That night, After the dishes had been washed and the oil lamp flickered low, Jacob sat by the fire with his hat in his hands, listening to the sound of her moving about the small cabin. He felt the walls closing in, not from discomfort, but from the weight of questions he dared not ask. Who was this woman, really? What storms had shaped her? Why had she agreed to marry a man she had never met? To travel across miles of unforgiving land only to stand before a stranger's door? When she finally settled across from him, her back straight and her eyes reflecting the flames, the silence stretched long enough to make his chest ache. Then she spoke, not timidly, not apologetically, but with a steady voice that seemed to echo truths she had carried too long alone. "You should know," she began, her gaze fixed not on him but on the fire. "I wasn't the bride you were meant to receive." The word struck him like a hammer against stone, sending cracks through every assumption he had built. He leaned forward, his knuckles whitening around his hat, the heat of the fire suddenly unbearable. She lifted her eyes then, steady and unwavering, as if daring him to turn her away. In that moment, Jacob realized the path before him was not one of simple companionship, but of secrets buried deep, waiting to either bind them together or tear them apart. And as the prairie winds howled outside, Jacob felt the first tremor of a storm rising, not in the skies above, but within the fragile walls of his heart, the twist at the wagon's edge. Jacob's breath caught in his throat, his world narrowing to the crackle of the fire and the weight of her words. She was not the bride he had been promised. Those letters, the tender phrases written by a woman he thought he knew, had not come from her hand. She confessed it plainly, her voice steady though her eyes glistened with memories too raw to hide. The woman who had written to him, she explained, was her younger sister, a fragile soul, too ill to make the journey, too weak to face the harshness of prairie life, desperate to give her sister a chance at happiness. She had taken her place, stepping onto that wagon not as herself, but as a substitute for a dream Jacob had been sold. The revelation split Jacob's chest wide with a flood of emotions, betrayal, confusion, and something deeper he could not name. He thought of the months spent reading those letters, clinging to each word, as if they were threads pulling him out of the abyss of loneliness. And now, sitting before him was not the writer of those words, but a woman who had carried the burden of sacrifice, shouldering a decision that had altered both their fates. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, indifferent to the human ache unfolding within the cabin. But inside, Jacob felt the air crackle with something he had not felt in years. Possibility mixed with fear. For though the truth threatened to unravel everything, part of him could not stop looking at her, at the strength that radiated from her, at the courage it had taken to face him with honesty. This was not the life he had ordered, but perhaps it was the one he needed most, the storm between them. The fire burned low, yet the silence between them burned hotter. Jacob sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched, his chest tight with a mix of betrayal and bewilderment. He had dreamed of a wife who would ease the loneliness, a gentle figure from those letters whose words had soothed him through endless nights. Now he felt robbed, cheated of the future he thought he was buying with ink and hope. His eyes flicked to her, and there she was, unflinching, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for him to speak. For the first time in years, Jacob felt the urge to shout, to demand answers, but the words tangled in his throat because there was something in her face that stopped him. It wasn't defiance or pride, but weariness, the kind of weariness that only comes from carrying burdens too heavy for too long. "You lied to me," he finally said, his voice cracking, half accusation and half confession of his own heartbreak. She nodded once, slowly, the flicker of the lamp catching the glint of tears she did not shed. "I did," she answered, steady as stone, "but not for myself." Her words cut deeper than anger, digging into Jacob's silence until he realized that behind this woman's choice lay a story far heavier than deceit. Still, the wound was fresh, raw, and the space between them felt like a canyon carved by years of loneliness now deepened by mistrust. As the night dragged on, Jacob wrestled with the bitter taste of disappointment, unaware that beneath the ashes of the storm lay the seeds of something neither of them had expected, the woman's true burden. The morning light crept through the cracks of the cabin, washing the room in pale gold, but it did nothing to lift the heaviness that hung between them. Jacob rose early, as always, tending to the cattle with stiffness in his movements, every step echoing the bitterness still lodged in his chest. When he returned, he found her sitting by the window, her hands folded, her gaze fixed on the horizon as though searching for something far beyond the prairie. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice softer now, threaded with sorrow. "My sister couldn't make the journey," she confessed, her words slow and deliberate, as if each carried a weight that might crush her if she let it fall too fast. She was frail, barely able to walk some days. She wanted love. She wanted a chance at life beyond the sickness that chained her, but I knew she wouldn't survive out here. She turned her eyes to him then, and Jacob felt the raw honesty there, the ache of a woman who had sacrificed not for herself but for someone she loved. "So I came instead, not because I wanted to deceive you, but because I couldn't let her die trying to live your dream." Her voice wavered at the end, and for the first time, Jacob saw past her sighs, past the shock of their first meeting, and into the heart of a woman who carried pain as it were stitched into her very bones. He wanted to stay angry, to cling to the hurt of betrayal, but her words pulled at something inside him he had buried long ago, compassion, the kind that came only from recognizing another soul's suffering. In that moment, Jacob realized their story was no longer about the letters that had brought them together, but about the choices and sacrifices that would decide if they could remain. So that Jacob's reckoning with loneliness. That day, Jacob worked the land harder than he needed to, pushing his body against the soil, the cattle, the relentless sun, anything to keep from thinking. Yet no matter how deep he buried himself in labor, her words followed him like a shadow. All those years of silence, of waiting for someone to fill the hollowness inside him, had left him clinging to the fantasy of those letters as if they were a lifeline. And now, stripped of that illusion, he was forced to confront a truth he had long denied. It wasn't the words on the page he had needed. It was the presence of another human being. He thought of the evening spent alone by the fire, the empty seat across from him, the meals eaten in silence. He had begged the sky for companionship, and though it had arrived in a form he did not expect, perhaps it was no less an answer. By the time he returned to the cabin, sweat soaking his shirt and dust clinging to his boots, he found her at the stove, humming softly as she stirred a pot. The sound, so simple and unassuming, caught him off guard. It was the first time in years that his home had carried the voice of someone other than himself. He paused in the doorway, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Grief for what he had lost, yes, but also the fragile stirrings of gratitude for what had been given. And as he watched her there, filling the silence with warmth he had not asked for but desperately needed, Jacob felt the first crack in the walls he had built around his heart, the first signs of belonging. As the days stretched into weeks, the rhythm of the ranch began to change, almost without Jacob realizing it. The chores that had once been his burden alone were now shared. She hauled water with a strength that surprised him, mended fences with hands that knew work, and tended to the animals with a gentleness that spoke a quiet patience. Slowly, the cabin no longer felt like a hollow shell, but a place that carried laughter, the scrape of chairs, the warmth of meals cooked with care. Yet it was not just her presence that shifted the air. It was the way she carried herself, not as a guest or an intruder, but as someone who belonged. Still, Jacob wrestled with himself. At night, when the prairie winds howled and the fire's glow softened her face, he caught himself studying her, wondering if the life unfolding before him was something real or just a fragile illusion ready to shatter. She had taken the place of another, yes, but each day she seemed less like a substitute and more like the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. One evening, as he watched her kneel by the fire to mend a tear in his work shirt, he felt something stir in him that was both terrifying and tender. The realization that his heart, long frozen by loneliness, was beginning to thaw. And though neither spoke of it, there was a quiet understanding building between them, that perhaps what had begun as a mistake might, in time, grow into the very thing they had both been searching for. Trial by hardship. The turning point came with the storm. Dark clouds rolled over the prairie one evening, swallowing the horizon with a fury that Jacob had not seen in years. The wind tore through the fields, rattling the cabin walls, and when the rain came, it was not a gentle shower but a roaring sheet that threatened to wash away everything in its path. One of the barns collapsed under the weight of the storm, and Jacob rushed out into the chaos. His body braced against the wind as he tried to lead the cattle to higher ground. To his shock, she was there beside him, soaked to the bone, her hands gripping the reins, her voice rising above the thunder as she steadied the animals with a strength that matched his own. For hours they fought the storm together, their muscles burning, their throats raw from shouting, until the worst had passed and the land lay battered but not broken. When they stumbled back into the cabin, drenched and exhausted, Jacob looked at her with new eyes, not as a woman who had deceived him, nor as the sister who had taken another's place, but as his partner, shoulder to shoulder, carrying the weight of survival with him. Sitting by the fire, their clothes steaming in the heat, Jacob felt something shift inside him, a recognition that trust was not built by promises on paper, but by battles fought together. And in that moment, amid the smell of wet earth and smoke, Jacob realized that the bond between them had been tested not by words but by fire, and had endured. When love took root, after the storm, something unspoken settled between them, a quiet bond that no longer needed explanation. Jacob found himself watching her in the smallest of moments, how she brushed the hair from her face as she worked, how her laughter slipped out unexpectedly when the chickens scattered at her feet, how her presence filled the cabin with a life it had never known. For years, Jacob had thought love would come like a spark, sudden and consuming, but what grew between them was slower, deeper, like roots pushing through stubborn soil, steady and unshakable. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the prairie stretching endless and golden before them, Jacob reached for her hand. It was rough, calloused, a worker's hand, but it fit his as though it had always belonged there. He cleared his throat, words stumbling as he confessed the truth he had been carrying, how he had longed for companionship, how he had clung to letters that weren't hers, and how, despite everything, it was her strength, her honesty, her very presence that had breathed life back into him. She listened quietly, her eyes softening, and when she spoke, her words were simple but steady. Then let us begin again, not as strangers bound by a lie, but as two souls who chose to stay. And in that stillness, beneath the wide Texas sky, Jacob realized he had found what he never thought possible. Not the fragile dream he had ordered from a letter, but a love as real and unyielding as the land itself, the home forged from truth. Seasons passed, and with them the sharp edges of mistrust softened into something enduring. The ranch, once a place of silence, now echoed with the sounds of shared life. Her voice calling the cattle, his laughter rising at her sharp wit, the rhythm of two people who had learned not only to endure but to belong. Neighbors who once whispered about Jacob, the loner rancher, now spoke with quiet awe of the couple who had turned hardship into strength, their bond forged not in the smoothness of fairy tales, but in the grit of storms weathered side by side. Jacob often thought back to the day the wagon arrived, to the moment she had stepped down and shaken the very ground of his expectations. He realized now that love had not come in the form he thought he needed, but in the form he could not live without. A woman twice his size, with a heart large enough to carry her sister's dreams and still have room for his own brokenness. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the prairie in hues of fire and gold, Jacob looked at her across the porch, her eyes reflecting the horizon, and whispered, almost himself, "You were the answer I didn't know how to ask for." She turned to him then, a small smile breaking across her face, and in that smile was a promise of all the days ahead, hard ones, soft ones, and everything in between. The loner rancher was lonely no more, for his cabin was no longer just walls and wood, but a home, filled not with what he had ordered, but with the unexpected, imperfect, and undeniable truth of love.